we're going to move on to our next speaker, and that is David Crane. He is with Bose Public Affairs Group. Any DEPA member that's been around for any amount of time knows David. He has been doing lobbying work on DEPA's behalf in DC for 10 plus years, I believe, since about our founding. And he, just a little about his background. He once worked for Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott. Before that, he was Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. He also was a policy advisor to chairman of the Senate Committee, senior policy advisor to chairman of the committee, Senator John McCain. So David's been around, and he's one of those guys when you're in DC and you're walking around with him, everybody knows him, and it makes it a lot of fun to travel with David in DC. So he's going to talk to us. I think we may even have a few slides he's going to talk from that we're going to put up. So David, it's all yours.
Great, great. I don't know, Cindy, are you going to pop the slides up, or otherwise I can just go ahead and we can talk through it?
I sure can. Are you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right.
What Jerry doesn't tell you is they know me, and when they see me coming, they turn and run the other direction. That doesn't necessarily bother me, but it was a tough act to follow. I'm going to just keep calling him Majority Leader McCarthy, but in hopes that we'll have a self-fulfilling prophecy here. But it's a tough act to follow, but I thought I'd hit some highlights and really try to dial things in a little bit in terms of what the implications are for domestic energy, and just touch on, again, at a very high level, what I think the environment is out here, because it's going to be challenging, even if we anticipate the best outcomes. We've heard a lot about, over the last few years, the establishment in Washington. I can tell you that it's alive and well, that it's a very real thing. If you had any question over the last few days in anticipation of the Biden presidency, we've seen commission after commission, committee after committee being announced to solve the problems of the country. And as anybody who's ever been involved in politics, and I think everybody on this phone's had a fair amount of experience, the way you kill issues is you assign a commission or a committee. The ultimate outcomes are usually predetermined. And it's basically a way to take a bunch of academics and politicians and self-interested parties and put them on a committee, essentially to save the rest of us from ourselves. So with that having been said, I'm going to focus on sort of state of the House, state of the Senate, state of the presidential campaign, and then what's at stake, if you will, for the domestic energy industry. Next, please. So state of the House, I'm just going to touch on this. What I would urge you to do, I've got three big pictures in this presentation. Red and blue tells the story. And this is really what we're facing as a country, is a situation where it's essentially, for all intents and purposes, the coastal United States versus everybody else. And nowhere is that more reflected than it is in the House. So while you have a lot of geography, as we know, House seats are assigned or determined based off a population base. So those highly densely populated urban areas along the coast and in a few places in the interior are essentially right now in a power struggle with the rest of the country to essentially impose their theory, their philosophies, their political ideas on all of that red. And that's core, that's what's at stake. As Leader McCarthy pointed out, there are +5 seats and counting. We're looking at additional GOP wins in Alaska. That's an at-large seat. It's already decided. They're just slow to count the votes. But we're also looking at picking up additional seats in New York and California. So the House is going to be, I think, increasingly critical. As Leader McCarthy said, part of that is the ability to perhaps co-opt some of those moderate Democrats to the extent they still exist. Those suburban Democrats that really got hammered in this election, guys like Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania, for example, got through by the skin of their teeth, but they know that everybody's watching now. President Trump did an excellent job, as we all agree. We wish it could have come out earlier, but did an excellent job of finally fleshing Biden out on fracking, on domestic energy. He forced a lot of commitments out of Biden to essentially say, hey, I'm not going to ban fracking, but there are important caveats on that we're going to talk about. But the fights are all going to start in the House, and the ability to get those job numbers, get those economic development numbers, to further define what domestic energy independence and security means to the electorate as a whole is not only going to help us in empowering those GOP members of the House, and where we can find support on the Democratic side in the House to articulate our argument, to use those policy debates as platforms to make our arguments. But it's also, in theory, a way to help shape that underlying legislation. And we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like in a little bit. So next slide, please. In state of the Senate, all roads lead to Georgia right now. I mean, in terms of where we are, again, the Alaska vote's coming in slow. Dan Sullivan, who was a guest speaker at a previous DEPA conference here in DC, one of the things that DEPA has really tried to do is identify those members that are up and coming, that are going to be strong on our issues, and forge those relationships early on. We saw a couple of real highlights of that in this election with Sullivan in Alaska. But we also, Todd Young from Indiana, who also spoke at an earlier DEPA conference here in DC, was chairman of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, and has really done a fantastic job in a year where the Democrats not only were bragging about expanding their control of the House, but also were completely confident of their ability to swing the Senate. While the game is not up, we're much, much closer. So, right now, it's important to remember that the Democrats only need to net 3, assuming that Biden will ultimately be declared the winner in the general election. That would mean Harris can cast the deciding vote in the Senate in a situation where there's a tie. We've had that a couple of times in the last 10 or 15 years, or 20 years or so. So it's not completely unusual, but those are essentially the stakes that we're looking at. So again, Sullivan's going to win. You can set that one aside. It's all they're actually declaring Tillis also a speaker, and we actually did a fundraiser for Tillis through DEPA in the last couple of years. So he's going to pull that race off. Real tight one down in North Carolina, but he's going to win that. And so it's all going to come down to Georgia. The key to Georgia is that in the general election, you have to win a clear majority. If you don't win that 50% of the vote, then you go to a runoff. That runoff will occur January 5th. So the next 2 months, I would steer clear of Georgia, because it's all going to be, if we're talking $100 million in a South Carolina Senate race that nobody thought we were ever going to lose, you can imagine what people like Michael Bloomberg, the environmentalists off the West Coast, the radical left, they're going to pump into Georgia. And to put that in perspective, in this election, Stacey Abrams, who ran a few years ago and lost as governor, has 800 full-time employees that she's been operating in Georgia for over a year, who are doing nothing but going out and, frankly speaking, filling out registrations for people on laptops and iPads, and then filling out their ballots and submitting them for them. So it's a formidable ground operation that we're going to have to match. The good part about that is the Republican Senatorial Committee has known all along, because of that Georgia 2 seat, where Johnny Isakson retired for health purposes and Kelly Loeffler was appointed to that seat. We knew all along that was going to go to a runoff. And because of that, the NRSC has been planning. We have Republican officials at the top of the government in Georgia. And so there's some level of confidence. But, looking at the outcome of the election, Purdue almost got there, 49.7% of the vote. There was a libertarian that was running in that race as well that was pulling votes off of Purdue. I haven't seen the final count on them, but the estimate's more that it could be anywhere between 2 to 4%. So that should be enough if we do everything right to put Purdue over the top. I think there's more confidence there just because he's run before. In that second race, I believe in that Georgia 2 race, there were something like 30 candidates in that race. I confess I haven't yet drilled down into candidate number 19, 20 through 30 to see how much vote they got and what it might add up to. But the bottom line is, what we can do as a jumping off point is look at the fact that Warnock, and these are both in Ossoff and Warnock, very liberal candidates, totaled 32% or almost 33% of the vote. When you combine Kelly Loeffler's vote of about 30% with Doug Collins' vote, or excuse me, about 26% with Doug Collins' vote of 20, Loeffler is in a very strong position going into this runoff, but we've got to get her above 50%. And again, everything turns on that capability. It's essentially a jump ball. So they hit the reset button on the election. Nobody wants to hear this, but I don't know if you're all being targeted with text messages now. I get about, maybe one a minute on a daily basis of fundraising solicitations, but the campaign spending limits are reset in those runoffs. So it's a new ball game for anybody who's looking to support these candidates. Where they put money in before, you can start all over again. I know, again, we all love hearing that, but it's vitally important because, again, if we don't do this right, all Biden needs is 50 Democrats. So he just needs to swing a total of 3, and they will have control of the Senate. And at that point, all types of bad things. I saw the distinguished senior senator from West Virginia yesterday on all the cable news channels saying he would not vote with Schumer to in the filibuster. He would not vote with Schumer to stack the courts. But it's pretty conspicuous on the day after the election, with 2 Senate seats up in Georgia, to have a Democrat out there saying, hey, believe me this time, I'm not going to vote with my leader if it means taking control of the Senate and delivering on legislation. So I think we should all assume that if the Democrats get to 50 in the Senate, at that point, it will simply be a matter of time before the legislative filibuster ends. And that's very, very important. If you go back to that red map, that sea of red with coasts of blue on the left and the right, that means that those urban areas will have carte blanche license to impose any policy they want on the rest of the country. There's a big difference between saying we're going to end the filibuster so that we can get appointments made to cabinet positions and political positions in administration. There's a big difference between saying we're going to end the filibuster so that we can get members of the bench appointed for federal, for district, for federal circuit courts and the Supreme Court, and saying we're going to end the filibuster and allow a very small geographic portion of the country that has very unique characteristics relative to the rest of the country to impose their will on everybody. And when you look at that struggle in the House and those progressives, if Biden's sitting at the White House with a pen and Pelosi and AOC and the radical left and the Democrat are passing legislation in the House, it's just a matter of time before Chuck Schumer has to buckle if he's the majority leader and get rid of the filibuster, because let's not forget, he's up in 2022 and there's a congresswoman that's sitting up in the Bronx who's pretty radical, who's probably looking to either get out of politics or find a way to move up. So it's just mission critical that we get that 51 seat, that 51st seat in the Senate to hold on, build that firewall, hold out until 2022. Okay, Cindy, if you could switch to the next slide, that'd be great. So the Georgia runoff this is to understand what's happening here. In 2018, the census estimated that the population of Georgia grew by almost 1 million people between in 2010. So that number's throwing me off a little bit. But the bottom line is there's been a huge demographic shift in Georgia. It's primarily concentrated in the counties in and around Atlanta. And it's a liberal vote. And you can see the statistics in terms of where that population is coming from and what the obvious challenges are. I noted Stacey Abrams' operation in Georgia. It's all Go TV all the time. She'll be out there again. So we've got to be ready to go. And as I said, Georgia will decide. We've talked about where Purdue and Loeffler are. I'll leave it at that. But this is just an exercise in raw political power. Who can force the votes? Who can get people registered? Who can get those ballots filled out? Who can make sure they get turned in? There's going to be, unlike the general election, I think an enormous amount of scrutiny on that process on the front end. To my mind, that's where the fraud occurred, was in registering people and filling out their ballots for them. You see a lot of that when you hear the talk about Biden-only ballots, where you just had a ballot that just had Biden, didn't have any down ticket votes cast. That's an example of where there's likely fraud and or likely criminal activity in terms of how voters are being registered and how their ballots are being completed. So there's going to be a lot of scrutiny. There's going to be an enormous amount of outside money, and we've got to be ready to go down there on all fronts. Next slide. So state of the presidential. The president's in a tough spot. I'm just pretty candid. I mean, I think probably some of the people in the vanguard of support for the president, certainly with Mr. Ham up front, have been out there. We're all still fighting. We're all still supporting. You've seen Majority Leader McCarthy out there arguing to give the president time. You've seen Majority Leader McConnell out there arguing give the president time to make his case. I would point out, if we go back to the year 2000, I'd urge everybody to remember that we called the press, not we, the press called Al Gore president-elect for 4 weeks before the Supreme Court ultimately cleaned up the mess in Florida. So we are not even in unprecedented times in terms of litigating the outcome of an election, making sure that there's no fraud, making sure that every vote's counted. And just to drive home the point, I've listed below here in those key states. At the top of the list, I would say this. Those are big numbers for the president. They seem small relative to the country, but typically in recounts and when elections are challenged on a state-by-state basis, you're typically talking about moving 100 or a few hundred votes, not thousands and tens of thousands of votes. So I think for the president's perspective, what their burden of proof probably is at this point is to demonstrate large-scale fraud, not to go in and hope to get it back by clawing back a ballot here or there, but to look for a pattern of fraud that calls into question the validity of the overall election. But a very, very, very steep hill to climb for the president. I think we just have to be honest. If you're looking for a feel for how quickly this is all going to happen, I included sort of the deadlines for certification and canvassing in some of the key states. Some are less important to others, but as the leader pointed out, Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Georgia are the keys here. So this is what the president's up against. I will note that Alaska is currently listed as yet undecided, but the president's expected, just as Dan Sullivan and just as the congressman up there is expected to win that. So it's really going to be down to the president's ability to turn that vote in Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Georgia to get from 214 to 270. On the other hand, Biden doesn't have to do much at this stage to get across the line. So, this is a state of play. But the president has every right. The votes have not all been counted in most of these states that are still up for grabs. So let's give them some time and see if they can present the evidence and make the case. That's my argument. It's perfectly reasonable. And for all the noise and chatter, it's only been the AP and a couple of others that have declared Biden the president, not the states that have to certify it. And let's have all the votes be counted and see if he can make the case. Next slide, please. So factors, like I said, Trump will win Alaska and North Carolina. That gets him to 232 and leaves him 38 short. I think I've got my math right there. I went to state college, so I mess it up sometimes. I list target states broadly defined, but again, I think it's Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. You can run the numbers there. I put how many electors are in play and how important it is. The president really has one path at this point to reelection. It's through those states. So keep an eye on those cases. There's been all kinds of allegations, some of dead people voting. That happens in every election. And again, while that's important, I doubt that at least it would be precedential, not presidential, but precedential if you picked up more than, a few dozen or 100 ballots on things like that. In Pennsylvania and Michigan, where there's a lot of allegations of late ballots being in, about whether or not those ballots were being corrected as part of that process. Just notice I missed a closed parenthesis on the Wisconsin, my apology. But you can see the various types of things that they're looking at. So in Wisconsin, they're pushing for a recount. In Pennsylvania and Michigan, where they think there was fraud in counting the ballots themselves, they're asking to simply stop counting all those ballots that came late. In Georgia, it's how those ballots were handled. In Arizona, again, ballot counting is a key issue. Failure to notify voters of improper in-person ballots is a central component in Maricopa County and some other places, allowing them to correct those ballots so that they can be counted. So you kind of see a range of different issues across the board. But again, I think given the numbers at the end of the day, it's going to have to be a burden of such large scale or significant fraud that particularly in places like Pennsylvania, where the administration has a tricky deal. The Republicans in Pennsylvania had appealed the idea of taking these late ballots, the ones that came in. Basically, most states before the election required that all ballots have to be received by the end of balloting on election day. But in Pennsylvania, the election commissioners decided they were going to continue to count. They went to the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania, who agreed with them and actually created sort of a set of rules around how those ballots were to be handled. That when it was challenged to the Supreme Court, which at that time went to a deadlock at 4-4. There were only 8 justices. But essentially what the court said was, we don't have time to adjudicate this before the election. So we're basically going to tell the state of Pennsylvania that they have to segregate those late ballots. They can count them, but they have to keep them separate, and that the court would make a determination after the election as to the validity of those ballots or how they should be counted. I would point out that Alito wrote that opinion and directed the segregation of those ballots. The powers that be in Pennsylvania ignored the Supreme Court and were not segregating those ballots. And Alito had to issue a second order to force them to segregate those ballots. We've all seen then what happened on TV in terms of access to the counting. So that's going to be the center of gravity. And I think that's really the case to watch, because if you knock Pennsylvania out of that list of 3 key states, there's really no other path for the president to get there. So while these other recounts and other litigation matter, it really at the end of the day turns on Pennsylvania. Next slide. So what are the implications for us, right? And so right at the top, and Jerry's compiled a fantastic list. I didn't have time to incorporate it into the deck beforehand, but I'm sure we can circulate it afterward. But there's literally 30 or so executive orders that either directly or indirectly were issued by the Trump administration to assist in development of energy in the United States, transportation of energy, export of energy. All of those EOs, I think we should assume, will be gone on day one. What's done with the stroke of a pen can be undone with the stroke of a pen. The Biden administration, when you look at Joe Biden, he's parsed his words here. So he'll say on the one side, no, I'm not banning fracking, only on federal lands. That's where I'm going to do it. So that's an immediate, per Mr. Ham's earlier comment, an immediate snapback to the Obama administration policy. But more importantly, then he goes on to say, and I'm going to eliminate all their subsidies. Well, as we know, we are not a subsidized industry. The renewable industry is a subsidized industry. What we do is we deduct our ordinary business expenses, we depreciate our assets, we use IDCs, we use percentage depletion, tertiary, all of these other tax provisions. When they say, when the president-elect, if we're going to give him that title now, says I'm going to eliminate the subsidies, that's really what he means, is he's going to put us out of business through the tax code. And that's why it's so important to hold that Senate, because as long as they do that, to move a tax bill without something called reconciliation, which I won't get into on here, but it allows, if both the House and the Senate pass a budget, it allows essentially the Senate to move a final tax bill with a simple majority. And again, if they get to 50, they have a simple majority, then they can do anything they want with the tax code if we're not able to knock off some Democrats or a couple of a couple of Democrats in the House or the Senate. So in fracking on federal land, we should assume that on day one, eliminate our tax provisions. And then most importantly, in my mind, is they're going to continue to go after access to capital. And one of the things that DEPA under Mr. Ham and Jerry's leadership have done is we've been working with the Justice Department to look at antitrust conspiracies between big equity firms like BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, with the leaders, the presidents of 4 of the 5 big money center banks, which really control access to capital in general, to basically impose restrictions on the ability of energy production companies, transportation companies, to be able to access capital by requiring, all kinds of non-scientific measures of risk associated from everything from reputational risk, but for banks and financing these projects, to climate change risks, which don't have any scientific basis in terms of how they're calculated for purposes of capital. But I can tell you, working with a number of financial institutions, this is a very real thing. And what we've been able to do in the Trump administration is hold that off. But I can assure you that anyone who's appointed to the Fed, anyone who's appointed to the OCC, which is the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which is the primary banking regulator, the FDIC, and any of these banking regulatory agencies, it is going to be a litmus test for them to get that job, that they support imposing these sort of restrictions on financial institutions in an effort to choke off access to capital by energy companies in the United States. We also know the Paris Accord is coming back. Now, that's the Paris Accord in and of itself, but back to the ESG issue. Remember, the big integrated oil companies, for the most part, not entirely, are European-based, but they're all doing business over there. And they're all being punished. They're caught in the squeeze play between the activist groups, the banks, the private equity firms, and the European regulators to force them to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy or get out of that business. So these companies are going to be looking to import that, and we see it in the financial services industry all the time. The big insurers are all European-based, and they're constantly working to pull those European regulations into the United States regime for regulating financial companies so that they have a level playing field, so they don't have to deal with one set of issues in Europe and one set of issues and one set of regulatory controls in the United States. And I think we're already seeing it, but we're going to see a lot more now when the Biden administration comes in. Those big integrated oil companies are going to look to cozy up, and the trade associations they control here in town with the Biden administration, and look to cut deals that get them a more uniform regulatory structure that reflects Europe, not the priorities of the United States. In Congress, we've heard about the Green New Deal. They're talking now about a transportation bill next year as part of the stimulus package. On this one, we don't just have a problem with Democrats. We have a problem with a lot of Republicans too, who either like ethanol or are in the suburbs or perceive that they need to get on the right side of the Green New Deal for political purposes. So we're looking at that transportation bill almost certainly be loaded with every kind of subsidy, every kind of direct taxpayer investment in renewable energy and renewable energy infrastructure. And again, we talked about elimination of key tax provisions and that just massive pressure in Congress from the House Financial Services Committee, from every other regulator who has jurisdiction over the banks, over the insurance companies who do huge investments in bonds and equities, to get out of financing, out of investing in fossil fuels. I'm not sure if that's the last slide or not. Cindy, is there anything additional there? So just critical factors, and I'll wrap it up on this one. We've got to hold the Senate as a firewall in legislation, not just ordinary legislation, but on tax legislation. The other thing is, because of the work of DEPA, because of the work of a lot of people on this phone, Because of the work of President Trump. We flushed Joe Biden out. We forced the Biden campaign. We forced a lot of Democrats to make commitments on domestic energy, and we need to hold them to that. We need to leverage those commitments to squeeze as hard as we can. And again, the target is less about the Biden administration than it is about those moderate Democrats in Congress that are trying to hold on. We need to coordinate closely with our allies on the Hill and the House GOP and the Senate GOP to give them the talking points that they need, to give them the support that they need to go out and make the arguments for them. We can no longer just rely upon them to do it. DEPA has not done that. But I think the writ large energy industry has kind of rested on the laurels and the hard work, rested on their laurels and the hard work of people on the Hill. We are now in an existential crisis. We've got to fight it tooth and nail and make sure we're giving the ammunition to people on the Hill. As referenced by Leader McCarthy, there's a shrinking pool of moderate Democrats. We need to really drive home that energy independence and jobs messages with them. And we need to start focusing now on 2022, because if we get that firewall in place, we've got to hold it. Chuck Grassley is going to be somewhere around 90 years old when he's running for re-election. He's our friend as long as we don't hit him too hard on ethanol, but he's there as a reality. That's going to be a tough one. North Carolina, we've seen how close the numbers are there. Richard Burr is retiring. So that's going to be an open Republican seat in North Carolina. In Pennsylvania, we're all watching the numbers there. Pat Toomey's retiring. He's been a staunch advocate for us. We got to make sure we hold that Republican seat. And Ron Johnson, who's not all that outspoken on our issues up in Wisconsin, but has been a very reliable vote for us, is also up for election. So we got to make sure we start now to reinforce that firewall and make sure it holds in 2022. And then just as the last point, I touched on it earlier, we've talked about the establishment in Washington. That's no more evident than the energy lobby in Washington, which is going to look to cozy up to the administration. Money talks, so those big integrated oil companies are going to start to drive the agenda, and it's not for us. They don't use IDCs. They don't use percentage depletion. They don't have the same challenges for transportation, for exports that we have. So we've got to really realize that DEPA is going to have to be the strong point in this fight in the next couple of months, in the next couple of years. Now, the bright side of all of this is I think that it is highly unlikely, and I'll say this in a close, that Joe Biden's going to be running for re-election in 2024. In order to do his deal with progressives, he had to take the most liberal member of the United States Senate and put him on the ticket as his vice presidential candidate. If we can get through this election, hold that majority in the Senate, hold it in the midterms, and potentially pick up the House, we are going to be in a tremendously strong position in 2024 to take back the White House if it's a President Harris or a Vice President Harris running for the presidency against whatever Republican emerges that can capture all that red that Donald Trump put together for us. So ending on a strong note, we've got a leg to hold this year. We build the wall, we hold that wall, we reinforce it, we expand it in the House in 2022, and then we get right back in there in 2024.
All right, David, thank you so much. And we've kind of come to the end of our time slot that we had allowed for this. If anyone has questions for David, if you want to submit them directly to him, if you have his contact or to the DEPA office, we'll be sure and get them to him. We do have one request for his PowerPoint slides, and without objection from him, the DEPA office will send those out to everybody that's on the webinar today.